I'm Dave. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm glad we get to open the scripture together. We all know that every second is the same length, but not of the same importance. Certain seconds, certain moments matter more than others. We pass through most of our days without paying much attention, but then suddenly something happens. Anyone who lived through 9/11 remembers exactly where they were when they heard the news. It was one of those moments that changed us, so we can't forget. Some people remember the time that they found out they were pregnant, or gave birth, or learned that someone they love passed away. The world just seems to stop for a little while. The seconds seem elongated because there's so much emotion and meaning packed into them. Others remember the moment that they fell in love. Everything was going along fine, and then bang, in one moment you knew that everything's going to be different from now on. For others, it was the moment they discovered their calling. Suddenly they were confronted with a problem they hungered to solve, or discovered a gift that they didn't realize they had. And in that moment, they realized something new about the way that God made them and why they're alive. I remember vividly the moments when I became a Christian, when I broke my back, the first time I held each of my children or met those we adopted as teenagers. I remember several instances when God showed up miraculously by providing or proving himself in ways that changed my life. It was 33 years ago, but I remember exactly where I was sitting the moment I first saw Michelle, who's now my wife. Awkwardly, I was sitting with the girl I was dating at the time, but I knew instantly that Michelle was the girl for me. Turns out that was not such a special moment for Michelle. She has no memory of meeting me that day. But for better or for worse, that day changed her life, even though she didn't notice anything. Do you have moments in your life that changed everything? Usually it's moments when our emotions are aroused, our anger, our hope, our desire, our despair. Maybe there was an opportunity or encounter that shaped your soul and altered the course of your life. In the passage we read earlier, Moses had a moment like that. But it wasn't the first one. Last week, we began a new sermon series from Exodus, which is the story of God leading people from captivity to community. And as Pastor Eugene preached so powerfully last Sunday, this story opens with the Israelites suffering the most ruthless kind of slavery at the hand of the Egyptians. But God had a plan to save them. Exodus chapter 2 begins with the birth of Moses, through whom God will one day rescue the Hebrew slaves. And in order to accomplish that, God engineers some very unusual circumstances for Moses. He was born to a Hebrew mom, but adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and then returned to his birth mother to raise him until he was about 12, at which point he was yanked back into Pharaoh's palace to be refined and educated as a prince. And this experience uniquely prepared Moses to be the insider-outsider whose dual identity would be used to set his people free. But all that jerking around also had some repercussions, and probably left him with a reservoir of chaotic emotions and confused identity. And he lived between two worlds. He wasn't fully at home in either, fully embraced by either. Some of you know how disorienting it can be to grow up between two cultures, or straddling blue-collar and white-collar cultures. Who was Moses really? Who was his family? Was he an Egyptian prince or a Hebrew slave? Was he the oppressor or the oppressed? Should he feel lucky or guilty? He's not sure. And all this raw, unexamined emotion was aroused when one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them. at their hard labor. Can you imagine all the chaotic feelings Moses had in that moment? Why are they down there and I'm up here? And this tornado of emotions escalated immediately when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. But realize, this was the moment Moses was made for. God had equipped him to address this exact injustice. This was his call to action. If Moses had recognized what God was doing, what God had been preparing all those years, this might have been the moment when Moses' entire life suddenly made sense. God was calling him through this fire burning in his soul, but instead of inspiring him, the fire consumed him. He was so blinded by his unresolved rage and guilt and resentment that he missed God's invitation in that moment. So self-righteously, he tried to accomplish God's will, but not in God's way. The Hebrews were held captive by the Egyptians, but Moses was held captive by his unexamined emotions. So looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. His whole life had set him up for this moment. He had the power to do something about this injustice. He was the prince. He could have used that authority to change the system so that his people would be free. But Moses missed that moment. He gave in to his rage, and he went down in flames. Because when Pharaoh heard of all this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled to the far side of the desert. In a moment, Moses squandered all the authority that God had given him. We all have moments like that, don't we? Moments where we just blew it, ruined everything. Hopefully they don't end in murder, but in a moment of exhaustion or embarrassment, anger, anxiety, we can let some reckless words fly and they kill the spirit of our spouse or our child or a friend whom we were called to love. Maybe you don't say anything at all. You just freeze that person out, ghosting them or giving them the silent treatment because you're upset. Other times we behave in self-centered, childish, or impatient ways that have consequences we later regret. All of us have done this. And we do that because whatever it was that provoked me, my child's disobedience or my friend's joke taps into my unresolved feelings of insecurity or disrespect that I experienced earlier in life. And so instead of seeing this as an opportunity for discipleship in my child or in me, I crack down viciously in a way that does nothing to heal me, but wounds them. Maybe another time somebody questioned or challenged your opinion or decision, and you blew up because it feels like they're challenging your core values or your legitimacy to make that decision, when in fact, God's giving you a gift through them by helping you see something you're blind to so that you can accomplish your goal even better. A couple of weeks ago, I was leading a meeting that didn't go very well. Some people seemed to be accusing me of things that I felt were unfair. I was kind of irritated. I was a little annoyed. In those moments, I tend to power up, become more forceful and controlling. And I felt that familiar fire burning inside me. But thankfully, I kept my mouth shut. Because after my emotions had subsided, I realized that the turmoil was actually my fault. So the others were responding very reasonably. Only later did I recognize what God was doing in that situation. Not sending me in to set everybody straight, but inviting me to see my pride so that I could learn to lead and serve in a better way. But like Moses, at least at the moment, I missed it. because it didn't occur to me that God might be using these people who were resisting and annoying me to heal me and help me grow. It was a gift, but I almost missed it. Other times, it's not our chaotic emotions that make us miss God in a holy moment. Sometimes it's just our frantic pace. Maybe somebody says something to you, but you blow it off because you're busy. I mean, you're not realizing that they were trying to reach out and make a connection that they needed, or maybe you needed. Maybe it was a moment God was putting you in touch with someone who might be a future spouse, or future employer, or future disciple. Maybe someone with whom you've had a conflict was extending an olive branch. You're taking those first tentative, terrifying steps towards reconciliation, but you missed it because you let your busyness or your bitterness prevent you from seeing that God was bringing healing and restoration in that moment. Hebrews warns, don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. That person that you blew off may have been God coming to you in some form, but you missed it because you weren't paying attention to the nudge that the Spirit was giving you to stop and care. That day in Egypt, God was calling Moses into ministry. But Moses missed it. And it changed the course of his life. As Pharaoh's anger burned, Moses got benched. He was exiled to taking care of somebody else's sheep on the far side of the desert. And he was out there for 40 years. 40 years. It must have seemed like God had forgotten Moses out there. Essentially, Moses had been demoted from a prince to a parking lot attendant for sheep for 40 years. But God had not forgotten Moses. God was training Moses. God was there the whole time. Moses already had all the gifts that he needed to lead, but he needed to be emptied of his ego and pride and anger that kept him from loving others and listening to God. In the desert, the Lord taught Moses patience and humility and how to lead and feed a flock that wasn't his, so that one day he could lead God's people out of Egypt. We read that during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. It's time to give Moses another shot. One morning, Moses led his sheep out to graze like he did every day. Nothing special about that. We read they were grazing on Mount Horeb, which it sounds sort of like spiritual and majestic, mountaintop moment. I mean, it's spiritual and majestic if you're thinking of something like the Swiss Alps, right? Oh, incredible. But Mount Horeb isn't like that. It's just another random pile of rocks in the harsh, dry desert on a day just like any other day for the past 40 years. But while he was standing around for hours, suddenly Moses saw something strange. A bush that was on fire. I mean, already that's strange. But stranger still because somehow this bush was on fire, and yet it didn't burn up. Moses had felt a fire burn inside him years ago, but it consumed him. And yet this bush burns without being consumed. How's that possible? So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight. Why the bush doesn't burn up? Moses notices something out of the ordinary and pays attention. He realized that something special is happening, though he's not sure what. It must have been confusing or maybe even a bit scary, but instead of rushing right by or running away, Moses walks closer. And it's then that God speaks. God had been there all along. God is the fuel for this undying fire, but God didn't speak until Moses stopped to pay attention. Those of you in High Rock huddles have heard these interruptions from God referred to as kairos moments. Moments when God shows up unexpectedly in ways that, well, it's kind of right in the middle of daily life. And sometimes these moments are confusing or scary. But often we'll find God speaking to us there if we pay attention and don't just rush right by. Moses missed it the first time God called. But this time, he responded differently. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he'd gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Don't come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." Holy just means different, special, set apart. This is a sacred space. Some of us have heard this story so many times that we don't really think much about that statement, but it's actually kind of funny. You know, when I think of a holy place, I think of something like Notre Dame or St. Peter's, someplace with stained glass, or a sunset, or, of course, Gillette Stadium. But this is Mount Horeb, an ugly hunk of unremarkable rock in a desolate desert. Do you know what the word Horeb means? In Hebrew, it just means wasteland. There's nothing holy about this place. There's nothing special, nothing sacred. It was an ordinary place on an ordinary day until Moses realized that God was there. Because wherever God is a holy place. It's a special place. Because things that aren't special on their own can become special depending on who's there. Pretty much every cute little inn on the East Coast boasts, at one point, George Washington slept here, which is either an extreme exaggeration or evidence that Washington was seriously narcoleptic. But people say it because it makes that place seem special. So I don't need to go to St. Peter's or Notre Dame or High Rock to see God. Because any place that I notice God can become a holy place. And any moment, a holy moment. Your dinner table could become a holy place. If, just as an argument is about to start, you notice those feelings burning inside you and you stop long enough to pay attention. St. Paul warns, in your anger, don't sin. Now, being angry is not a sin, but as Moses illustrated 40 years before, we often react to our anger by sinning. But there's another way. We could slow down to listen to the anger or fear, jealousy, or grief that's burning inside us. God's almost certainly not calling us to strike out with violence, but God may be calling us to do something. So pay attention. That time you didn't fall into that same old destructive pattern or apathetic pattern could become a holy moment, a turning point in your life or in your family. In order to do that, we need to pay attention to our feelings. St. Ignatius insisted that God often speaks to us through our emotions. We see this in Luke 24, when two disappointed disciples were walking away from Jerusalem after the man that they had worshipped as the Messiah had been murdered on a cross. They thought the story was over. Their hope had been crushed. But as they walked, they met a mysterious stranger who questioned their assumptions about where God was in that moment. And beginning with Moses, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. It was only when Jesus prayed and broke bread for supper that they realized God had been there all along. He'd been with them the whole time. How could they have missed him? They asked each other. Were not our hearts burning within us as he talked to us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? God often speaks to us through our emotions, so don't miss that moment. Because it can become holy ground. When we pay attention, God can speak, like he did to Moses, which can change that situation instantly. So as you feel what St. Ignatius called consolations, which are good feelings like hope, love, trust, mercy, or desolations, which include things like fear or greed, rage or defensiveness, stop, like Moses did at the bush, and ask, where's God in this? What's God saying to me right now? How could I follow God in this moment to bring healing and life rather than pain and division? When Moses listened, the Lord said, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. That's what Moses was born to do. That was the fire that had been burning in his soul 40 years ago. But that time, rather than look for God in that moment, Moses took matters into his own hands and he ruined everything. Or at least he postponed it for a long while. What if he'd listened all those years ago? Might the Israelites have been set free much sooner and more easily? We'll never know, because Moses didn't look for God. He just reacted to his emotions in a way that was deadly. But there's good news for us in this story. Because like Moses, a lot of us have missed God in an important moment. And we've done something destructive. We hurt someone badly. We ruined a relationship or our reputation. We torpedoed our career. Or we sinned egregiously. Those moments can feel like the end of the road. My story's over now. I mean, I blew it. But no matter how bad whatever you did was, I bet it wasn't as bad as Moses. I mean, Moses murdered someone, which was a disaster. And yet God wasn't done with Moses yet. And God's not done with you yet either. Moses shows both the danger of missing God, but also the possibility of redemption God can bring to even the worst of our mistakes. This, right now, may be a holy moment for some of you. If you stop long enough to see God in your despair or defensiveness and listen. If you can confess your sin and receive God's forgiveness, and then follow Jesus in a new kind of life. But before Moses could lead anybody else out of bondage, he needed to be freed from captivity to his own chaotic anger. And this is always true. Before God can do anything great through you, he has to start by doing something great in you. What does God have to do in you? What is it that God needs to work on so that you can serve in the way that God created you to, gave you this longing for? What's getting in the way? In that bush, Moses saw that the fire inside can be from God, but it doesn't need to consume us. If the fuel for our feelings is God rather than our own self-righteousness or unresolved emotions from the past, then our passion can become a blessing to others that rights wrongs and heals wounds rather than compounding the evil the way we too often do. Today, we live in an outrage culture in which we assure ourselves and others of our virtue by advertising our anger against anything offensive, which is kind of like everything. Right? Internet comments and political discussions and protests seethe with self-righteous rage, but do little to generate healing or goodness. We protest so strongly about these people who are being maligned or abused, marginalized, and yet do very little to actually help the individuals themselves. We just want to vent our wrath. We burn with indignation, but often let it consume us rather than motivate us to ask God what we should do. It's so easy to jump right into the fray and feel good about ourselves for telling somebody off. But Paul cautions us, everybody does that. But don't conform to the pattern of this world. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. How can we be transformed like this? It starts by paying attention to God. You know, many of us live at such a frantic speed that we rush right by any burning bushes around us and we miss them without even noticing they were there. And then we wonder why God seems so far away. God's never far away. God is everywhere. David asks poetically in Psalm 139, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your right hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast." David's point is that there is no place that God is not. There is no place that God is not. What there are lots of places we don't expect to see God because they just seem so mundane. And that assumption makes us miss God because we're not even looking. But if we make a regular practice of slowing down to look, we're going to discover we're standing on holy ground a lot more often than we realized. 2 weeks ago, I was lamenting with some of the other pastoral staff that I have almost no opportunities to interact with people who are not already Christians. I love Christians, so nothing personal. It's just, how can I share God's good news with anyone if everyone I see already knows it? And as I went through the next day, I started paying attention. I went to McDonald's on the way home for a Diet Coke, like I do almost every day. But I ordered from the kiosk, like I do every day, so that I don't have to talk to anyone. And then I stopped by the supermarket where I use self-checkout, so that I don't have to talk to anyone. And then I went to the gym where I wear noise-canceling headphones so that I don't have to talk to anyone. The next day, as I was praying, I wondered, Lord, why don't I ever get to talk to anyone? During that prayer time, I felt challenged by God to do things differently. The next day, I went to McDonald's, but I actually ordered at the counter, even though the kiosk was working. And I ended up chatting with the manager who sees me there pretty much every day, but I've never spoken to her. And we started chatting, and she told me all about her vacation. And then while I got gas, I talked to the station attendant who told me about his family that's overseas and his financial concerns for them. And then at the gym, I took off my headphones and actually said hi to people, like on purpose. And one guy I knew just a little bit took off his headphones in response, and he started talking with me. And one thing led to another, and about 30 minutes later, he asked if his girlfriend and he could come and see me sometime for pastoral counseling. He's not a Christian, but he's eager to talk to someone who is because he thinks God may be able to help him. He'd known I was a pastor for about a year. And I passed him and waved several times a week for more than a year. But I never stopped to see whether God may be doing anything there because I just assumed that he wasn't. In fact, God had been present all along. But it took me a year to be present enough to notice. My Moses moment started simply by paying attention. I have so many things going on, just like you do, so many pressures and demands and deadlines that I need to be deliberate about making time to stop and listen each day so that everywhere I go can become holy ground. Our staff has been using the Pray As You Go audio prayers each day, which has been very helpful for me. Many other Christians use St. Ignatius' model of taking 5 minutes before bed each night to pray through the day past and acknowledge where they saw God. And then notice where they may have missed God. Then they pray through the upcoming day so that they don't miss God there. Every week, every other week, church staff gathers to share God sightings. We learned that from our kids at Summer Blast. But sharing stories of where we see God at work helps all of us realize that we're on holy ground all the time. A friend of mine, another high rocker, gets to work a little early each day to do the same thing before anybody else in his company arrives. He prays through every single meeting on his calendar for that day, for the content of the meetings and the people that he's going to meet, because he realizes that every moment is holy ground where God can speak and use us if we're listening. Friends, God is everywhere. The spiritual life is cultivating the capacity to recognize the burning bushes in the last places that we usually look, including triumphs or despair and the busy monotony of our daily lives, so that we can hear God speak and respond. If you want help doing that, our Anchor community is something you should look into. In addition, High Rock has spiritual guides and spiritual directors who can help you look for God in your circumstance, or if you're having a hard time seeing where God could be, or understanding what your burning bush means. When you get bad news or bad diagnosis, God is there. Look for God in that moment. And what felt like a wasteland, a Horeb, a horrible place, can become a holy place. After my frustrating meeting a few weeks ago, rather than rushing ahead and just pushing it behind me, I stopped to listen. I asked God what I missed. And God challenged me about ways I need to repent and grow that are going to be uncomfortable, but life-giving. So I'm eager for it. Whether you're at a party or in an emergency room, or just another boring day at home or work or school, God is there. Stop and look. And that place can become holy ground where God can speak in unexpected ways. When you feel angry or afraid, look for God. God may share your anger and may be calling you to act. Or God may be leading you in a new direction that will bring new blessings. After recognizing that God is everywhere, in Psalm 139, David concluded with a prayer that I pray regularly. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Is there a place in your life right now that feels like a Horeb, a wasteland, where you feel far from God? Maybe it's a relationship or your workplace, a decision that you feel stuck in the middle of. The journey out of captivity begins by recognizing God is there, listening for what God instructs, and then obeying whatever God tells you. If there's a place where you're stuck, can I invite you to begin this 8-week series on Exodus with us by looking for God in your Horeb and saying yes to whatever God commands. That is the only way to the promised land. In moments when I feel alone with my questions and frustrations, my feelings or my fears, I stop and ask, where's God in this? What's God teaching me? How's God inviting me to follow right now? Is what God wants even possible now? That's what Moses wondered after God told him to go back and save the slaves. When Moses expressed his fear, God assured, I will be with you. Even there. Even in Egypt. Everywhere. No matter where you are this week, no matter where you're going to go this week, God is with you pay attention. And everywhere you go can become holy ground. Let's pray together.